Hi everyone, thanks for joining. My name is Mahmoud Matouk. I'm an identity specialist here at AWS. And today I'd like to present to you the new Amazon Cognito User Pools console and highlight some of the new features and improvements in this console and also do a quick 10 minutes tutorial on how to create an OpenID provider on Amazon Cognito User Pools. This should give us a good exercise to walk through the console while learning some of the basics of Amazon Cognito User Pool. To begin, and just as a refresher, what is Amazon Cognito User Pools? And if I were to do this in just 2 minutes, Cognito User Pools is a fully managed user directory for web and mobile applications. It allows you to add features like user sign in, sign up, and profile management to your applications with a few clicks. As a managed service, it offers you the security and availability you need for your applications. It comes with support for multi-factor authentication, advanced security features like adaptive auth and compromised credentials check, beside the original SLA availability of 3 nines. It also offers you hosted sign-in and sign-up pages and native integration with social providers like Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. It supports open standards like Federation to SAML and OpenID Connect providers, plus offering the OAuth 2 authorization code grant type and client credentials grant type for your applications. And as part of the overall ecosystem, it plays well and works well with other AWS services. For example, Application Load Balancer and API Gateway have native support to Amazon Cognito. And finally, Cognito User Pool is a set of building blocks. So it offers you a flexible set of APIs and SDKs in different languages that allows you to build on top of these building blocks. Moving on to today's topic, Amazon Cognito User Pools just launched a new administration console. It improved and backed with new features and improvements from the existing console. So, of course, the best way to explore this is to just jump into the console and start exploring it. But before we do that, let's highlight some of the improvements that I personally like. One of the big improvements is offering more guidance to customers as you configure and create your Cognito resources. So one of the improvements in the new console is that it's use case driven. It helps you to make the right set of decisions to reach the outcome that you expect for your end users. You will see a lot of guidance through this new console. It's also adaptive that will show you only the relevant settings based on the choices you make. And this is going to help you make the right choices and understand what is the effect of these changes to your end user. The new console is also optimized for larger scale Cognito deployments. If you have hundreds or even thousands of user pools and application clients, it should be a lot easier to manage them with this new console. You will have search and filter capabilities on anything that is of a type list. Another big improvement or a new feature in this console is the ability to edit user profile right from the console. This should allow administrators or customer service with the right set of permissions to edit user profiles or even sign out the user right from the console. In case you want to sign out the user from all devices, you can do this now from the console. Another UX improvement in the new console is the better grouping of features together. So you only see 7 tabs in the user pool details page. Users and groups are self-explanatory. Everything about sign in one tab, everything about sign up experience in one tab, and then messaging, app integration. This is mainly where you spend most of your time because this is the most complex set of configurations for the user pool. And then user pool properties. This is where you configure Lambda triggers. So it should make it a lot easier to operate your resources and manage them in this way. Now let's get to the console and see some stuff in action. I'm going to do a quick tutorial on how to create a user pool and how to offer this user pool as an OpenID provider, mainly enabling the OAuth 2 endpoints for configuring the hosted UI and doing basic flows like creating a user and allowing this user to sign in using the OAuth 2 authorization code grant type with Pixie, and I'm going to use Postman for this testing. As you access the new console, you will see the banner alerting you that there is a new console experience and also providing you with links so you can submit feedback. To begin, let's create a new user pool. Creating a new user pool starts with asking you for the authentication providers that you would like to use to authenticate users into this user directory. So by default, Cognito user pool is enabled, so you have users to be signing in with username and password and creating and managing their own profiles incognito. But you can also choose to support federated identity providers. So if you want to add signing in with social providers like Facebook, Google, Apple or Amazon, or you would like to add SAML or OpenID Connect providers, you have the option to do this as you create the user pool. So I'm going to just select a couple of these so we can see the configurations, but I will not actually configure them. And then from here also you choose how users will sign into your user pool. So would you like to use only username or username and email? Allow users to sign in with username and email. You can also choose to allow users to sign in with a preferred username, which is an additional attribute that allows users to change their username if you want to offer this as a feature in your application. Moving on to the next step, defining the password policy, whether you accepted the defaults from Cognito or you customize this policy based on your requirements. The multi-factor authentication, I'm going to choose optional for MFA because I don't want to enforce this on all of my users. Probably in your case, you might need to require multi-factor authentication. It depends on your requirements. And I'm going to choose the Authenticator app, which is a TOTP option and also SMS MFA. And this will allow you later on to configure this per user. So every user can choose what multi-factor authentication medium they would like to choose. In the next step, you define the ability to allow users to sign up, or this will be only managed by administrators if you want to allow self-service sign up or not. What attributes you would like to verify. Would you like to verify the email or the phone number? And any required attributes that you need to define for this user directory. If you want to add any custom attributes, you can do this from here. You can also come later on and add custom attributes as needed. The next step is configuring messaging, whether emails or SMS messages that you will send out from your user pool to end users. The recommended option is to use SES. You can also use the Cognito default, which has limits of 50 emails per day. This is just for testing environment or if you are trying out a new user pool or a new feature. But generally for production or something that you will use for continuous development, it is recommended to use SES. On the SMS side, you need to define an IAM role that is authorized to access SNS because in Cognito it uses SNS to send out these messages. Because we choose to enable Google and sign in with Apple, I have the options to configure these providers here, but I will skip them for now and adding a name for the user pool. The hosted UI is already enabled because at the beginning we chose to support external identity providers like Google and sign in with Apple. When you do this, then your user pool automatically becomes an OpenID provider and it has to enable the OAuth 2 endpoints. As part of offering your user pool as an OpenID provider, you will need to define a domain name for this user pool. So this is where the OAuth 2 authorization and token and user info endpoints will be hosted, and this is how you integrate with other identity providers. You can use a Cognito generated domain, or you can use your own custom domain. I'm going to go with the easy option of choosing a Cognito generated domain. And then you will need to create an application client so to be able to integrate with other identity providers or to be able to sign in users or sign up users. Now you'll see clearly that there are three types of application clients, and this is going to adjust the settings based on the best practices and recommendations for these types of application clients. In OAuth 2, there are two types of application clients. There is a public client. This is usually what is used with mobile applications or web applications, single page applications, and so on. And these are considered public, so they don't have a client secret. Because in these types of applications, there is no way to secure or protect a secret on the client side. The other type of application clients is the confidential client. This is where you have server-side authentication. And the third option is a free form that you can choose whatever configurations that works for your use case. So I'm going to go with a public client because this is supposed to be for a public web application. Because this is a public client, you see that the default configurations is that there is no client secret for this application. And then I will have to provide the allowed callback URLs. This is usually my application callback URL that Cognito is going to send the authorization code to after successful authentication. I will explain the OAuth2 authorization code grant type flow in a minute. But for now, I'm going to keep it at localhost just for testing. Then I have a review screen that allows me to review all of the settings and configurations I added to this user pool, and then I can create the user pool. Once on the main screen of the user pool, you have users and groups. You have the sign-in experience with everything related to sign in this tab. In messaging, you will see the configurations for email and SMS and also the message customization templates. In app integration, this is where you manage application clients. If you open a certain application client, you will see the settings of this application client, what authentication flows are allowed, what are the attributes that this application client has permissions to read or write, any hosted UI customizations that is specific to this application client, because you can brand the hosted UI differently for different application clients, and any advanced security features that will be overridden for this application client. And the last tab here is user pool properties. This is where you configure the Lambda triggers. And you will also notice that the Lambda triggers are grouped to make it a lot easier for you to understand which triggers will be invoked in which flow. As we now have a good feeling of the console itself, let's look at how to integrate with this user pool as an OpenID provider. Mainly, how to invoke the authorization code grant type against this user pool to sign in users. As you saw, as we created the user pool, we added a domain to this user pool. This domain creates the OAuth2 authorization server for us and hosts the endpoints needed for that. And there's also a discovery endpoint for this user pool that you can use with any OpenID standard IDB that supports discovery endpoints. And this also shows you what is your authorization endpoint, what is your token and user info endpoint, and the JWKS endpoint. This is where you will find the public keys to use to verify these tokens issued by this issuer. Back to the app integration tab, and as we created an application client, if you visit this application client, you will see that the hosted UI is already configured for it, and you can actually view the hosted UI against this application client. Before we get any deeper with using the hosted UI, I want to take a minute to explain how the authorization code grant type works, and this will make it a lot easier to understand what we are seeing here. To understand how the authorization code grant type works with Cognito, or works in general, we have four main components. We have a Cognito user pool acts as an authorization server, and this is represented by the domain auth.example.com. We have an application or a client application. Represents your mobile or web application that is running in the browser or the user agent. And then we have an external identity provider in case you wanted to support social sign-in or federation with other OpenID Connect or SAML providers. So to understand the flow, let's follow the steps one by one. At the first step, your application initiates the process by redirecting the user to the authorization endpoint of the authorization server, which is Cognito user pool in this case. So you see at step one, the client application is redirecting to /OAuth2/authorize and passing the response type as code to indicate that this is an authorization code flow and passing the client ID of the application client. Now you have one of two flows will happen. If you want to allow users to sign in with native accounts, like with a username and password maintained in Amazon Cognito user pools, then number two will happen. In this case, Cognito user pool is going to redirect the user to the login page and displaying the hosted UI for the user to enter their credentials. If you want to sign in the users using an external identity provider, you can also pass this as a parameter in step one, and it's going to skip the Cognito hosted UI and just send the user directly to the external IDB, whether it's a social or a standard SAML or OpenID Connect provider. Something in between could happen, that you also display the Cognito default hosted UI, but it also has buttons on it to allow the users to sign in with Apple, sign in with Facebook, sign in with Google, and sign in with any other standard IDBs that you have enabled on the application client. So either number two will happen or number three will happen, and the user will have to provide their credentials either directly to Cognito user pool or directly with the external identity provider. In the case of an external identity provider, it will be slightly different whether it's a social or OpenID Connect or SAML, but in all cases, the user will enter their credentials with the external IDB. The external IDB will redirect the user either with an authorization code or with a SAML assertion. So in case of social or OpenID Connect, there will be some additional communication through a back channel between Cognito and the external IDB to exchange a code and get a token for this user. In case of SAML, the actual SAML assertion will be sent back through a browser redirect in the SAML response to Cognito. Now at step 4, the authentication process has completed. The user either provided their credentials to Cognito or provided their credentials with an external IDB, and there has been an OpenID Connect or a SAML exchange, and Cognito has verified that the user has been authenticated. At step 4, Cognito is going to redirect to the application callback URL and sending an authorization code. And also at this step, Cognito is going to set a session cookie on the auth domain that's valid for 1 hour, and this is used for single sign-on, as will be explained later at step number 6. At step number 5, your application at the callback URL has received an authorization code. Now, your application needs to take this code and go to the Cognito token endpoint and exchange the code for tokens. This should be done through a secured back channel if you have a server-side component in your application. But if your application is a mobile or a single page application, or you want to do this from the browser, you have to send a post request to the token endpoint. And if you have a single page application or mobile or a web application that will do this through the browser, it is recommended to use PKCE or proof key for code exchange. And I will explain this later on in the demo with Postman. After step 5, the application 1 has received the tokens for the user. These tokens can be used to display user information on the UI, for example, or it can be used to authorize access to backend. And this completes the authorization code grant type flow. Number 6 is something that you should keep in mind as well. Assume that you have multiple web applications. So you want users to be able to navigate between these applications without having to sign in again. And this is where the session cookie or the SSO session cookie comes into perspective. So if the user has signed in already against application 1 using the steps 1 through 5, and then the user attempts to access application 2, which is authenticating users against the same user pool or the same domain, then this application number 2 can start the authorization code grant type flow using the same step as step number 1, redirecting the user to the authorization endpoint and passing in the client ID for application number 2. Now, if the session cookie is still valid, the single sign-on session cookie, then Cognito is going to automatically sign in the user and redirect to the callback URL of application number 2 and sending an authorization code that can be exchanged for a token that is vended for application number 2. And this process happens for any number of web applications you have that might be authenticating the users against the same user pool. This gives you the single sign-on between these web applications. Now let's go and run this flow against our user pool and see how it behaves. I will use Postman for this demonstration. There are many tools you can use on the internet for testing OAuth 2, like if you just search OAuth 2 Playground or OpenID Connect Playground, you will find many tools you can use. I personally like Postman, and this is what I will use for this demonstration. So in Postman, you can just create a new request. Doesn't matter what URL you put here, we are not going to hit any URL, but we are going to the authorization tab, and we are going to select OAuth 2 for the authorization. In this tab, you can configure what is the grant type that you would like to use, and we are going to use authorization code grant type with PKCE or proof key for code exchange. And this is a recommended OAuth 2 flow to use for your applications. Proof key for code exchange is a process that mitigates or prevents the authorization code interception risks. The way that it works is that at the beginning of the authorization process, your application generates a code and then generates a one-way hash of this code and sends this hash to the authorization endpoint. At the time of token exchange, your application is going to send the code itself to the token endpoint. And the token endpoint is going to generate the one-way hash of this code using the same algorithm and compare the values. The value that was initially posted to the authorization endpoint and the value that is generated from the code that the token endpoint received. If the two values match, then this guarantees that the client that is claiming the tokens is the same client that initiated the process at the beginning. You provide the callback URL that we added or authorized on the application client, and then you provide the authorization endpoint for the user pool, the token endpoint for the user pool, and the client ID for the application client we have created. And you can also define any OAuth2 scopes that you would like to authorize through this authorization process or through this flow. I will not provide any scopes here because I didn't authorize any scopes on the application client. And then you can kick off the flow from this button. Let's open the console so we can see the interaction. And this is going to bring the hosted UI. Now we don't have a user in this user pool yet, so let's sign up and create a user. This has signed up the user and sent me an email for verification with a verification code. So I'm going to get this code and confirm the account. Now the authentication process completed and Postman received an authorization code and it used this code to exchange it for a token from the token endpoint. And these are the tokens I got from Cognito: the access token, the ID token, the refresh token. Now let's look at the console log and understand what exactly happened here. So the first call that started the process is sending a request to the authorization endpoint of Cognito. So this goes to the Cognito user pool domain, OAuth2 authorize, and passing in the response type as code, the client ID, redirect URL that I have configured for the local host, and the coded challenge. This is the big C part of the flow. This is where a code has been generated, and this is the challenge that is driven from the code. The next part, as we explained at number 2 in the diagram, on the sequence diagram, Cognito redirected me to the login endpoint or the login page, which rendered the hosted UI and asked me to provide a username and password. Because we registered a new user, you will see also that the next step was sign up and another sign up, another confirm. These are related to signing up a user and confirming them. But at the last confirm step, you will see here that there was a redirect to the local host, which is the callback URL or the redirect URL that I defined for this application, and it's passing an authorization code that is generated by Cognito user pool. Then you will see the next step is for Postman to call the token endpoint of the user pool. And if we look at the request body, you will see that the grant type is authorization code. Here is the code that Postman received, and this is the redirect URL, and this is the code verifier, which is the code that was originally created, and then the token endpoint is going to drive the one-way hash from it and compare it with the first value. Now let's run this one more time to see it without the sign up steps. I'm going to clear the cookies here, so I remove the single sign-on session, and then get new access tokens. This will bring in the hosted UI again, and I will use user 1 that we just created. And this completes, and then got the tokens. If we look at the console now, you'll see that there are only 4 calls here. The first one going to the authorization endpoint, the second one redirected to the login endpoint, which displayed the hosted UI and asked it for a username and password. And then this is the submission of the credentials. And then at the end of this step, you will see that there was a redirection to the application callback URL with an authorization code. And then the call to the token endpoint to exchange this code for tokens, and then the response was tokens from Cognito side. Now, as we have a user created in the user pool, let's go visit this tab. We see our user here. If you click on this user, you see the user details here. From this tab, you can edit the user profile. And from here, let's, for example, add an address for this user. You can also add a phone number and mark it as verified. You can also add any of the standard or the custom attributes that have been defined on this user pool. And this concludes the console walkthrough and also my tutorial on how to do the authorization code grant type with Amazon Cognito user pools. I hope you learned something from this tutorial, and I hope you enjoy the new console. Thanks again for your time and have a good day.